Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Genevieve Smith. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. And this is the first virtual brown bag on a series that we're hosting on inclusive artificial intelligence and strategies for current and future business leaders. Artificial intelligence is slated to be the largest economic opportunity of our lifetime and will disrupt businesses across all industries. But business leaders, current and future, must understand how to harness AI in a way that's equitable and inclusive. This series follows our recent work on mitigating bias in artificial intelligence and a playbook that we launched this summer for business leaders on the topic. The series does a deeper dive into 3 areas that strategies are needed. I'm going to share some quick background and then we'll delve into a discussion with our incredible speakers. So AI is expected to add $15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030. Students that leave Haas and other business schools, as well as Berkeley and universities more broadly, will undoubtedly be interacting with AI. AI makes it possible to automate judgments. AI, and particularly machine learning, is increasingly used to make decisions and predictions affecting most aspects of our lives. Whether this is who receives an interview for a job, which products are advertised to which consumers, how government services and resources are allocated, such as which communities are designated as high potential for crime, and how to allocate resources to COVID-19 patients in hospitals. AI has incredible potential to make decisions more efficient and cost-effective, while also promoting higher productivity and growth in the economy. And use of AI in predictions and decision-making can reduce human subjectivity. It can also help tackle different issues. So IBM, for example, is using computer vision tech with AI, seeking to eliminate cancer misdiagnoses that disproportionately impact dark-skinned people. While this is exciting, there's also risks to AI. As we outlined in our playbook, AI can embed biases and produce discriminatory outcomes at scale, also posing immense risks to individuals, society, and business. There's a widely used healthcare algorithm, for example, in the US, that falsely concluded that Black patients are healthier than equally sick white patients, reducing the number of Black patients identified for extra care by more than half. And just over a week ago, a tweet went viral from a PhD student that called out a Black faculty member who was erased from a Zoom call when the algorithm failed to recognize his face. When his white colleague posted about it on Twitter, Twitter automatically cropped the image to only show the white man. So the question is, how do we mitigate these immense potential risks, such as bias, and maximize the benefits of AI? How do we develop and manage AI that's both inherently more inclusive and that helps advance social inclusion and equity? In our playbook, we highlight 7 strategic plays to mitigate bias in AI. These plays are also necessary to make AI more inclusive, both in terms of an inclusive process of developing AI and having outcomes from AI systems that promote social inclusion and equity. Today, we're focusing on the first bucket of strategies, the role of teams in advancing inclusive AI. In our work, we found that 2 pieces are important as they relate to teams. First, we need diverse and multidisciplinary teams working on algorithms and AI systems. Who develops AI systems matters because it's their perspectives, lived experiences, and knowledge that's integrated into the tech. Large-scale AI systems are developed in a handful of tech companies and university labs that tend to be in the West, white, with folks that are white, affluent, technically oriented, and male. And as can be expected, there's huge gender and racial disparities. Who's in leadership matters too, as it's their priorities and values that are integrated into how AI is developed, managed, and used. There's also a lack of focus on including folks from other backgrounds, like social sciences and philosophy, who have critical perspectives and expertise to add to AI systems, particularly those that predict human behavior and inform things like resource allocations. Second, ethics is still a nice to have and often takes a back burner to market priorities, but it's critical for companies to prioritize, promote, and embed a culture of ethics and responsibility related to AI. For each of the plays, you can find mini guides that delve into them with concrete steps for implementation, supporting tools, and examples of leading companies. These mini guides, along with the full playbook, can be found at the link on the bottom of the slide. But these aren't exhaustive, and tough questions for all of us to grapple with remain, which brings us to our series on inclusive AI this fall. At later sessions, we'll be taking a deeper dive into the other strategy buckets, which are AI model and corporate governance and leadership. So today I'm really excited to have our incredible group of speakers. Asif Mohammed is an MBA and MEng dual candidate here at Berkeley Haas. He's the founder and CEO of an AI startup, Socratic, which uses natural language processing to drive civil and high quality debates and deliberations online. He's also a mentor and coach for startups at STEP, a Berkeley Haas incubator for early stage startups. We also have Jill Finlayson, who's the director of the Women in Technology Initiative here at UC Berkeley. Prior to Berkeley, she led mentorship and incubator programs for Singularity University Ventures, the toys category at eBay, an online community for School Foundation, marketing at startups, and the World Bank Striking Poverty site. And we also have Microaggressions, who's the responsible AI and AI for Good lead at PwC, where she advises clients and partners across industry, academia, governments on how to harness the power of AI in an ethical and responsible manner. She's played a crucial part in the development and setup of the firm's AI Center for Excellence, AI Strategy, and the Responsible AI Toolkit, which is a suite of products dedicated to operationalizing ethics in AI. She's also a globally recognized AI ethics expert. So with that, let's delve into our conversation. We really want to make this interactive, so please ask questions in the chat throughout as they come up. You can also raise your hand and ask your question live if you'd prefer. So as a first question, I want to ask, how important is the team, including who's on the team, as well as team dynamics for advancing inclusive AI? And Maria, maybe you can start speaking to your work around responsible AI and advancing advising various organizations on this topic. Your voice is a little quiet.
Hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Good evening, everyone, and greetings from London, where it's 8 o'clock and it's dark already. I think those are excellent questions to start with, and one of it that started to preoccupy us a little bit more since we passed the stage of drafting ethical principles, having frameworks and methodology. And now we're going into implementing a set of values in the technologies we develop. And if at first data scientists as a job and a skill was glorified to the extent that one data scientist had made it up as one of the posters of Yves Saint Laurent in Paris about 2 years ago, into somewhere around where an acknowledgement that we need data scientists, but they are not the only one that will contribute to building and scaling AI. So my team is now formed of machine learning engineers, data engineers, machine learning DevOps, but also interpreters and ethicists who work together around ideas that have potential to solve real client problems. But I would say that this is the core team that it is the core team that we are using throughout the various stages of the product. But during the product life cycle, we would have a different range of skills, from domain experts down to compliance, legal, traditional IT, marketing and comms. And we bring that all together to create this environment of collaboration. And hands on heart, this is the hardest to achieve, because we all know working cultures are not geared for collaboration, are more geared towards competition. And it feels a little bit at time that we go against the nature of the working environment. So we have to be mindful of that. But I would say that ultimately the teams that build AI is the cornerstone of responsible AI. And that goes on three different layers. First is the composition and the dynamic. It's not just enough of bringing those people at the table, is encourage them to speak, in challenging them to see things beyond that. And I was just saying before our conversation started that my data science team have watched The Social Dilemma, and at the moment they're all so excited about what they've seen. So guess what? I think they will start to ask themselves questions when we will start to see it from a different perspective. So this is the type of dynamics that we need to be fostering. the second layer is the support it gets from the organization. It's not just the support from the leadership, but also the support in terms of the right tools, the right training, the right guidance, and clear roles and responsibilities. Because yes, we don't want the situation with the Uber safety driver that was convicted for the case in 2018 to repeat. And also we want to protect people who build this technology in a proactive manner until we will start having potentially Hippocratic oaths for data scientists or for AI experts in general, or any other form to protect them against liability. And of course, regulation, which we know it's going to take a long time to get there. And lastly, I think why is important is in terms of empowerment for them to experiment and to ask questions, to break the status quo, and ultimately to drive change. Because there's one thing that we all need to comprehend: AI is not just the data set plus the model and potentially the hardware, is the context this technology is created and then used. And I really love a quote Churchill had and he was saying something around, we shape our buildings, therefore they are shaping us. And it's easy to see if you will replace buildings with AI, that in fact that we shape AI, but AI ultimately shape ourselves. And in the middle of all this it should be a team of open-minded people with a diverse background in terms of gender, race, age, but also expertise, to be able to get all those perspectives, because we're still innovating, we're still experimenting with AI, we still understand so little about it. And we know we need to have this to be able to progress and identify upfront potentially unintended consequences and be prepared for it.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's all really important considerations. And one thing that kind of strikes me when you're talking too is around like this notion of how do we, and one thing that we've kind of seen and also is related to another question that a different MBA student had brought up before was around, how do we really get kind of non-technical expertise to be valued when it comes to these questions as well? Because even within a lot of these big tech firms and things like that, it's almost like the technical expertise is kind of valued and what does it take to start to value these, other forms of expertise? Is it something where, whether it's performance review or how things are, performance reviews and what's prioritized, or like, what does it really take to actually make sure that it's not just like, oh yeah, we have social scientists on our team?
I really love this question, because look at me, I have graduated an MBA like you guys, and I've been through this journey, right? So I had to make a room for myself alongside those technical people. Although in my previous life I was engaged with software development, but I was still seen as an outsider for a while, until with patience and education of my team, not so much the leadership, I got to get their attention, because we all know data scientists are a different bunch of people as are computer scientists in general. So I think it's a matter of understanding the point of view and where they're coming from, and being able to open up their mind. And I think even personally, I tend to dislike more social dilemma than to like it. I think it's a good conversation opener, because it gives us the mandate to be able to explain what are the problems that emerge from or are surround the way that the story was told by the documentary. But I think ultimately we need to establish ourselves and being able to articulate, because from a data science perspective, they can't see the complexity of the business, and we know that. We all know what terribly complex system organizations are, and how difficult it is to trigger change, and how much of that dynamics is being reflected in the data that's being collected, how the data is being collected, and ultimately how algorithms are being designed. And we can support them do a better job, but we have to explain it to them, because I think it's that either sides are not used to have this interaction. We also have this problem, the rift in between business and technology with us for a long time. And now is the time to build a bridge, because otherwise we can't build reliable, safe, and responsible AI. And I can't stress enough how important it is for all of you guys in the call as non-technologists to really understand how this technology works, because the new leadership will have a huge task on their shoulders in using this technology in organization in a meaningful way. And the only way to do it is actually understand the inner works and being able to link it with the human angle, with the process angle, with everything that happens in the external environment. So sound understanding of technology is critical, but in the same time being able to pull the data scientists and technologists out of their world and the bubbles in front of the screens and lines of code into the world of humans and being able to capture their attention.
Yeah, definitely. I think in like the business school background, I mean, you have that, it has such a different kind of perspective that adds so much value to thinking about these conversations. And I'm glad you brought up the Social Dilemma movie on Netflix. You know, it's definitely an example around not necessarily incorporating different perspectives or opinions from other folks around what might happen when you pursue a path, and then, you know, the results that can ensue for society and individuals. I'm wondering, Asif, so, you know, as working on a startup and thinking about these issues, especially, you know, your startup is very focused around kind of supporting inclusion and advancing kind of democracy in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering, maybe, I guess if you could just share a little bit about your startup, and then, you know, how are you thinking about bringing in like diverse perspectives and demographics into this, and why is that important or not as you build your business?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question. And firstly, I just want to thank everybody for getting in the panel. I think it's an honor to be on this panel with the fellow speakers, and also more importantly, discuss on this topic, which is very important both for me at a personal level as well as considering the problem that we are solving at Socratic. So it's a great opportunity for Team Socratic to be engaged in this discussion. And yeah, to give some context before I share how I'm thinking about this issue. So Socratic is an AI-based app to facilitate civil and high-quality conversations online. And what we mean by that is that right now the incentive models on the current social media apps or other apps where you engage in any discourse are really around clickbait behavior, and they incentivize virality. So there is no incentive for being civil or even being yourself. I mean, the platforms are promoting you to behave in a way that works for them. And in fact, that's where like social dilemma also struck chord for me. In fact, when I wrote my blog post about why we're building Socratic, I intentionally mentioned social dilemma also, because we don't want to build another product where the creators are again regretting why we built this. And we are actually worried about having built this and again thinking of hacks to actually stop, or rather have caveats against not being influenced by our own products that we built. So from day one, we're actually being conscious about how we build this product. And that's where there is this framework that I think we should consciously follow as tech leaders, or let's say product managers. Like over this last 7 years of PM experience over different startups, I think one thing I've learned is that there's a lot of emphasis on who we're building the product for and why we are building it. And that's like the first step of product management, or even like building any solution. What I think we also need to focus on is what we are building and how we are building it. And I think when we focus on these two questions really well is when I think we actually build a solution which is more sustainable and also really addresses the problem really well. And what I mean by that is this, like when you talk about customer empathy and you're talking about understanding your users, which are probably a diverse group of people and probably a lot more complex than you imagine, the team that's building it is actually the part of how we are building it. And also what we're building it also is very important in terms of addressing through having a team which actually understands these two questions really well. And that's, I think, the path that we want to take at Socratic too, because the problem that we are solving, the first thing that requires us to do is actually be able to build a data set that we can use to build our algorithm. And that's that involves our users, our team members, to really understand what our users need and what we need to solve. Taking one example itself, if you want to solve civility and improve civility, the definition of civility means so different to me, compared to what it means to somebody else. And it could vary for somebody from a different gender, from different ethnic background, from geography, different demography. And I just can't go ahead and build this just because my definition of civility makes sense to me. And I think from day one, that's actually what we believed, that we believe in the Socratic method, which means that people learn through discourse and dialogue and asking questions. And that's what we've been doing from day one. Like our team even defined the problem statement, and the way we're going to approach this was through dialectic method. We actually had a group of people from our own, let's say pool of people that I could access while at Berkeley. And those discussions with diverse group of people actually gave me ideas on how we should build this. In fact, our first developer is a female candidate. It was not a choice to go after a female candidate, but it so happened that we define what the problem statement is and how we want to address it and the values that our team should have. And that's how I've been going across trying to recruit people. And it so happened that that person was the right fit for our team, and we got her on board. And that's how we're going about recruiting as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. I think, your point around like, what does civility mean, and recognizing that from different perspectives, it can mean different things. And so not wanting to kind of like impose your definition and getting, different kind of folks involved, both in terms of maybe their educational background, but also in terms of kind of like demographics as well. And that kind of leads me into the next piece around like, when it comes to diversity in teams, obviously I feel like there's a big focus when we talk about things like tackling bias in AI. Normally, one of the top things that people talk about is that we need to have more demographic diversity on teams so that different perspectives can be kind of incorporated and things like that. And Jill, I know that your center is the Witty is so focused on this and focused on kind of advancing gender and women in technology. Obviously, it's the name. But can you talk a little bit about, why is it so important to have diversity when it comes to teams? And then maybe like why it's also not necessarily the only thing that we need to advance inclusive AI and tackle biases as well.
Sure. So to take the couple examples that have been talked about, the social dilemma and also the photo cropping that you talked about at the onset, the interesting part about the response to the photo cropping was the response that, well, it didn't come up during development. We didn't see it, right? And so this really reflects on the fact that, if you don't have a diverse team, you will seldom encounter some of these problems, and you're not going to prioritize issues that you seldom encounter. Whereas when they posted this and the conversation took off on Twitter, in fact, Black people and women were saying, yes, this has happened to me all the time. I'm cropped to my chest. I'm cropped out of the picture. And so their experience, they thought was maybe unique to them, but in fact was systemic. And so building diverse teams is really critical. And I think one of the challenges with a lot of companies is they don't make an intentional effort, they don't make it an objective, and they're not accountable for really achieving that goal of diversifying their team. And they often expect that they can continue doing the same things and get a different result, which is not the case. You actually have to go look for talent in different places and make more of an intentional effort to be inclusive. That's at the team level, but what enables the team to be successful is the leadership. And so here's another gap that, MBA schools really need to attack, is this idea of making inclusive leadership how we do leadership, right? It needs to be part and parcel of how you view your work, your supply chain, your operations. It is not a siloed activity that happens over here. And what I mean by this type of leadership is you have to be able to build psychological security in your teams. If the teams don't feel confident that they can point out problems, you're not going to achieve your aims. If they can't say, hey, the photo cropping tool isn't working for some people, you're not going to achieve your aim. If you don't have the ability for people to voice concerns, point out problems without fear of retribution, you're not going to solve these problems. So, we need diverse teams, but we also need leadership that will then put these into the values and the DNA of the company. But then you also need systems and policies to reinforce those. So we need to make sure that people are advanced and compensated when they find problems in the system. We need to find ways to incent people to identify these problems earlier. So I think one of the biggest opportunities here for companies that goes beyond diversifying the teams is making the product scope, the product requirements, and the product design inclusive from the get-go. If those are requirements, then it's not an afterthought. You're not trying to fix things when the product's already out and causing harm, but you've actually made it core to designing the new product.
Yeah, Maria.
Can I add something? I think.
Oh yeah, of course, please.
What Jill said is phenomenally important. On one, the importance of the leadership in creating a culture of inclusivity. And I am glad to say that I see a lot of example of diversity and inclusion being one of the strategic issues, not just in PwC, but I think in many other big companies, non-tech companies, right? But that needs to be reflected in tech as well. I think where things are not as proactive is not just about diversity, being able to have a diverse pipeline, but also creative culture of inclusivity. It's not just about bringing the people, the diverse people at the table, is encourage them to speak, listening proactively to their points of view, and actually considering this feedback actively and with respect it requires. Because if anything else works well, but we don't do this, again, we're missing a big opportunity. But what also Jill said about having inclusivity center of the product development, I will say all the values that are relevant for one organization have to drive the way we develop those products and services. End of story. It's not an afterthought. And this is where I will pose a challenge to all of you on the call, is like, we need to be able to articulate what's the business case for ethics for AI, and being able to say that we don't treat ethics as compliance. We don't treat ethics as a process. Ethics is a behavior of the team and organization to develop those AI. And inclusivity alongside fairness and transparency and all the other ethical principles needs to drive the way we approach this. And I think that's the fundamental shift in the way we do business. We haven't had to do it before with business ethics. We have had to do it before with bioethics. But now in the world of AI, we need to be able to bring together these different disciplines and branches of apply ethics, bio and business, to kind of have a rounded approach for ethics of AI and ethics of technology in general. I think it's fundamentally important to create those links ourselves, and then being able to articulate that to the business leaders, so that we start driving the change that will take a long time. We all know that change within big systems in organization requires commitment, patience, and sustainability over time to see the result. And the last thing I want to say is about the difference in between two types of company and their approach to corporate and business ethics. We have the big tech companies that are new, that probably 20 plus years of existence, and they haven't had to focus or really consider the corporate and business ethics. And because of that, guess what? They actually deliver products and services that are not as ethical. And again, we've seen from Social Dilemma what it means. For the rest of the world and companies that have a long history, they have been challenged to consider business ethics. And for them is a journey of understanding what is applicable in the world of technology they use, they acquire, they build, and integrate it in the overall value agenda and the corporate ethics, to be able to be a seamless approach. Because otherwise, again, non-tech companies are going to struggle with this notion if it doesn't acknowledge for what they have, the system they have around ethics, and including that consideration of technology in the wider story of business ethics, which, by the way, I think we all know it needs a little bit of shake up as well, because yes, CSR shouldn't be the desk at the corner of the office with two nice ladies. It should drive the overall organization. I think we have to kind of finally make profit balanced with purpose the way companies operate, and not the other way around.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because even thinking about, like Microsoft recently shared in their report to the SEC how risk from bias in AI, or bias from AI, is a risk to the business. So, I mean, these are issues that are kind of core to the business, and they are, intrinsically linked with these considerations around ethics, and thinking about how to kind of build these cultures of inclusion within the company as well. And I think that, Jill, it's interesting the point you were making too around, obviously diversity is so critical. It's also not necessarily something that should be left to, the diverse person in the room or whatever to be able to have to call out, these issues that come up necessarily either. And so having this more culture where folks are able to share potential issues that might come up, I think is really important. But one thing that we talked about in our playbook is like, how do we actually move to have kind of ethics be more of the norm and the expectation? And especially because sometimes, ethics can almost be kind of in tension with market priorities, right? If ethics cause us to kind of slow down, it's like, oh, this could have a potential issue, and we might need to kind of step back and go slower. But my market priorities are kind of speed to market, having to be first to market. So how do we grapple with the fact that ethics can sometimes also be in tension with these, kind of immediate market priorities? And is there some sort of like mindset shift that's needed at the leadership level? And one thing we talk about in the playbook is perhaps integrating ethics more into kind of performance review processes, so it becomes more the expectation. So I was curious, what do you, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think outside the sector, and we're certainly seeing that there are new positions being created. Kathy Baxter is the AI architect, ethics architect at Salesforce, right? There are these new positions where they're realizing they need to participate not only in these conversations about ethics, but participate in these conversations of ethics across companies, right? And across sectors, because there's things that we can learn from each other. So, I think about Genevieve Bell was an anthropologist who was quite famous for being in a tech company and really making the innovation process human-centered and human-focused. And so we need to find the roles and make sure that they're getting the input early on, and not at later stages in these decision-making. And so that does come back to the leadership as well, right? Like leadership needs to be asking the questions, who's helped, who's harmed, what are the unintended consequences? And this is a board level question. This is a risk to the company. So we look at the ROI on diversity, better decisions, decreased risk, longer view, greater profitability. But there's also the stick side of it, that's the carrot, but the stick side says, artificial intelligence is human craft. If you do it badly, you are liable. You are liable for the harms that you cause. And so I think it's really important that this get elevated to that level of a board level discussion, that we have people asking these questions and being involved, and then thinking about how do we create these roles, make sure the roles are at the early stage of development, but also checks and balance at the other end. And I think this is one thing the guidebook, also the playbook, talks about that's quite helpful as well, which is AI has to be sandwiched in human training, right? Whoever's using that AI training needs to understand the limitations of that AI. It only sees a small piece of the story. It doesn't see everything. And so the humans who use it need to know what their role is to make sure that they're not overriding inappropriately, or they should be overriding in some cases.
I will also add that if that tension exists, Genevieve, there is a fundamental problem with that organization. This tension should not exist. So I think it's the leadership role to go and revise the vision and the values and how those are being reflected. And I think it's, yes, all roads lead to leadership again and again and again. But hey, we are in the company of future leaders. So I think it's important to have this in mind when you're going to take the next roles after the MBA, that it takes courage to be a leader. It takes courage to be able to steer the use of AI within one organization and actually challenge themselves and as a leadership team. Is, do we prioritize profit, which is going after this opportunity, or do we prioritize purpose, which purpose might be as it is in many organizations, to actually play a role in society? And that's another big opportunity we have, is while the civil society and the customer put a lot of pressure on all the companies to place purpose in the middle of everything they do and be much more transparent and aligned with that. I think it's the big opportunity to include the technology it's being used both internally and externally, plus the technology that is being sold out there within this group. And then we have a higher chance for that transformation that needs to happen at leadership level, at, I would say, the personal level, right? In the minds of the C-suite, this switch has to happen. We can't just go and hide behind corporate doors, because guess what? AI is like a mirror, and it will showcase what happens within organization. And look at two examples of unethical behavior, right? First, Amazon, the recruitment tool. We all know what happened, right? The Amazon Research Lab here in UK worked for 18 months to produce that. And the minute they put it live, it just was, biased against towards women, and it was taking off. And I spoke with the guy who actually developed it, and they said that they were not prepared for testing, and then they took all the correct steps into addressing and mitigating bias. Yet that tool still ended up being biased. That says something about Amazon as a firm. And second example is the Apple and Goldman Sachs card, which were again offering higher credit limits to men compared to women with basically the same characteristics. And the lesson in that case was that there was a ping pong of accountability. Apple said it's not us, is Goldman Sachs software. Goldman Sachs said it's not us, it's Apple and their decisions. And then again, AI is showing that you can't hide anymore. Sooner or later, an organization will produce an AI that will show the internal dynamics. So good luck to those who still think that corporations are dark enough, like black boxes, and they can hide themselves behind the black boxes.
And I would just add that, Goldman Sachs and Apple did not fix the problem. They turned the problem over to the consumer to self-identify. I think I may have gotten a lower thing. Can you reevaluate it? So nothing has changed. Nobody reevaluated the criteria that was used or the algorithm that was used. So I'm actually really curious, Asif, how you approach this, because you talked about who are you building for and why are you building it? How are you ensuring this in your company?
I was just about to add same thing. In fact, to go to the same point, that I don't think there should be a tension, because if there is tension, that means that something has gone wrong with the team and the way we've hired people. So I think somebody isn't thinking right. And when I say right, again, it comes back to the point that who are you building this for? Like, if you're building this for your customer and you have empathy for your customer and you care for your customer, then there shouldn't be any scope for malign interest or malified reasons for doing things. I think that's where the entire ethics discussion comes. Are you trying to covertly or try to put your customer, let's say, behind the veil and trying to, let's say, get him or her to do things that you wouldn't want? I think that's where I think the problem starts. So I think again goes back to the point that you need to have people who represent your customer that you want to serve on your team. And that diversity will go beyond gender and other identities as well. Like, for instance, in India, when we were building this product for nonprofits, it was software offering for nonprofits to enter data and CSR managers to handle data. And all my users were predominantly people from either rural backgrounds or from, let's say, they were actually predominantly women because, okay, I don't want to get into stereotypes, but typically the CSR roles have been filled by women, either good or bad reasons, but at least it was good for me because it was helping us actually think of the problems that we wanted to solve in social impact. And that was when I was like, it doesn't make sense for us to have an all-male engineer team because we're building the product for users who are women. And how can we not have women team members at all to even represent the user we're having? And that's when it again goes back to the question that we discussed, do we need non-technical members on team? Yes, we do. We can't have engineers building products for non-profits in rural areas using this product. So that's when we actually made a conscious decision that our team needs to represent the users we're building for. And actually we hired not just like, let's say, a balance of male and female, we actually tended to have people from non-profit background in our team so that when we're building features, we actually get to understand the user better. And people from rural backgrounds of India, not really from urban backgrounds. So I think it again goes back to the point that keep your customer in mind and then build something where your customer can trust you. And I think that relationship actually starts becoming stronger and it'll percolate across, like be it the values that you define your company or for the team members that you hire and the way you build your product as well. And specifically in case of Socratic, I think that's what we are trying to do. Like the definitions of civility and let's say quality behavior are so fluid and probably difficult to describe. And that's where we are having multiple focus group sessions. Like in fact, we have quite a few even lined up to have over the next few weeks with students across different schools of Berkeley, like not just the MBA school, because we don't again want to build something that the MBAs will love. So we are trying to reach across the schools to start off with. In fact, I would have just gone and hired an engineer that I really liked in India and built this product, but we consciously chose a call not to do that because we're not building it for that user. So yeah, I think it starts off with defining things, understanding the problem really well, and again goes back to hiring people who represent the cause and the issue you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I think those are all really important points, Asif, around how, it's a reflection of your customers as well. Like there's diversity is needed for so many different reasons, but having so like that demographic diversity in your teams is really important, but also having kind of that diversity from different educational backgrounds is really helpful and important. And then I think it also speaks to kind of you as a leader of the company too, though, and like the values that you have kind of set forth in the company and how that's trickled down and illustrates kind of the importance around having that sort of mindset and approach in leadership. So just to move to a couple questions from folks, and please, continue to type in thoughts and or feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask your question live too. But we have one question here from Satoshi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Satoshi. So not at a leadership level, but at an individual level, how can we realize and address microaggressions in a team to create a working environment where everyone can speak up without fears? And continuing, I often saw diverse people unmotivated or unable to speak freely under unspoken pressures and internal politics. Do you have any recommended strategies or tips? That is a very good question. Any initial reactions from folks? Well, I can share some of my thoughts, and Jill, I don't know, I know that you put in a link too, so maybe you have some ideas as well. But I think it's a really important question. It kind of goes back to also how, that people that have kind of diverse backgrounds can't necessarily also be the ones who are expected to speak up to bring up issues related to bias or ethics within the AI systems. And it's kind of a systems issue. I mean, one thing that we talk about in the playbook is how can we kind of address these sort of concerns that sometimes folks that bring up issues can actually face backlash. They slowed us down for bringing up these issues. And so it kind of goes back to the culture of the company as well. So, how can you, and I know you said at an individual level, but let me at just like a cultural level, addressing those kind of issues around how can you update the incentive structures that exist within an organization so that bringing up these issues is actually something that can help you advance at that organization. it's seen as something positive that you can kind of reference, whether it's in your performance reviews or other things. And one thing, when we had an earlier panel on this topic, we had a great a woman from Levi's, Katya Walsh, who was saying that they actually build these questions into their hiring process. So it's an expectation that folks bring up issues around ethics, and they have that in their hiring process. And then one other thing that we talk about a lot is how do you update performance reviews? And we have a kind of resource on the website that Ishta added before around different ways that we can update performance review processes. But in terms of kind of as an individual addressing microaggressions, I think, Jill, did you have a thought on this? You added a link below.
Yeah, I think, what we have is innovation is happening in the context of our larger universe. And in our larger universe, of course, we face issues with gender, ethnicity, and bias, unconscious bias. And so we need to have strategies as individuals on how we deal with these difficult situations and how we protect ourselves. And I think your point was very accurate that oftentimes these responsibilities fall to the one underrepresented person in the room. And that's not really fair either, to put this additional burden on them to be the one being the champion and looking out for the underdog. And so there are several things that come into play there. So one is personally how you can deal with microaggressions and finding the right place and time and way for dealing with those things. The second thing is for the other people in the room to step up and take that role so that the underrepresented person does not. So they can be the voice in the room, they can be pointing out the problem, and they can also second and reinforce somebody else's point. I heard what Jill said, and I thought it was really important. I think we should pay attention to this issue. If you're looking for some really great tips on being a better ally, there's an organization called betterallies.com. They send out a newsletter with tips every week, and there's also a book around it. But the fact is, there are small little things you can do to make sure that people's voice is heard, that their voice is amplified, that they get credit for the things that they're doing. And then to your point, we need to have a more systemic level discussion about what is the criteria for advancement, what is the criteria for promotion and raises, and make sure that we are compensating people who are really doing important work and actually saving the company from potential risk and harm, like Twitter faced with the image cropping tool, right? If they'd had somebody who had been willing to be that voice, that would have happened. And then I think overarching this is we need leaders who have really competent skills around psychological security and building teams where people feel comfortable being the voice in the room.
I will also want to add that there are two types of challenges as part of the microaggression. One is a personal attack, and the other one, it's referred to a topic, an ethical topic that needs to be challenged. And I think besides ways of coping with this microaggression, the organization has to start thinking about channels to collect this feedback about the ethical issues that exist in relation with technology and being able to process it. So having this organization of ethics, which is on one hand giving people a voice in a protective way to highlight those ethical issues that happen, and for those issues to be really considered by groups and boards, and being able to see with resolutions. I think it's equally important, because otherwise we won't be able to discover the unethical behavior that lingers around our organization. And even more important, a lot of the organizations, so from our clients, have actually confessed they are a little bit afraid to go and audit their current systems. They don't even call it AI, their models, because they are certain they're going to find high levels of bias, and they don't know how to deal with it because they're not prepared. So I think it's once at individual level, yes, need to help individuals, but also the leadership is important, again, at both the team level and organizational level, to foster the right culture. Is important to have those channels to collect the ethical, unethical behaviors and deal with that as it comes along. Because ultimately, it's not going to be down just to the ethicists to spot those instances. It's down to everyone within an organization. And as I said before, it's really important to acknowledge that ethics is owned by no one and by everyone. And ethics, because it's not the process, it needs to be a behavior, a BAU behavior for everyone within an organization. Data scientists, ethicists, C-suite, compliance, legal, all of us, we have to embark in this type of behavior. And that's when we see probably a change in personal behavior towards those marginalized groups that are being brought gradually into the mix.
And I really like about I really liked what you said about the interview process and asking a question during the interview process, like how might you raise a flag if you feel like there's a problem with the AI? Give me an example of a time when you've had to stand up to authority and maybe point out a problem. Here at Berkeley, one of the questions they ask is, how do you promote, tell us how you promote diversity and inclusion. What do you do? How do you approach that? And it is literally the first question that people are asked. And so you're kind of choosing the people who fit the DNA. That said, it is still a very challenging thing to raise problems, to slow process, to slow progress. And so some of the other things that I've heard in the HR side that could have transferability over here is this idea of a warm line where you can report things anonymously that you have concerns about, where you wouldn't have to necessarily take attribution. That speaks to a lack of psychological security, I will say. But at the same time, giving people a variety of ways to channel concerns could be a really beneficial to this process of raising the ethics questions and giving people a format where they feel comfortable to share concerns.
Yeah, definitely. And so another question that's coming up from Marlita is, how can we know the AI product is not biased before it is released and used? Would anyone like to take a stab at that?
I feel like Asif should go first.
Asif, yeah, what are some thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think, that's a good question, because it again goes back to the point about being, okay, let's break it down, right? Why is there bias in the AI data set? So, and there are different stages to it, like in terms of, the data set that you look at, and then the kind of algorithm that you want to build, and then who is going to build that algorithm, and then eventually you're going to release it onto the users and then get them to use it and then give you feedback. The problem is in the entire loop, if you have, let's say, biases creeping in just because you didn't have enough representation of ideas, identities, then I think the biases will start creeping in, because it can start from step one itself. Like you just didn't even look at how let's say polarized your data set already is, and then whatever you did afterwards is just totally, I would say it's garbage in, garbage out. You've just not done anything which is valuable. So that's the way I would think of it. Think of the funnel and then start being conscious of each of the steps on how we are dealing with those. And to answer the question more specifically, like if you're saying that can we test it better? Yeah, that's the whole point of having how we build things, that it shouldn't just go on to the final step of quality assurance, where we've put a bunch of quality assurance team members very representative enough to test the use cases. You actually should again focus on how you're building it, because the product specific, in fact, I think it goes a lot more deeper. Like when I'm writing my product specifications right now, which an engineer has to pick, I'm very conscious of what are the different use case scenarios. And that's when I'm trying to sensitize myself on, okay, how would a user from this age group think about this problem? How would somebody from, let's say, a Latin American background think about this issue? So I think I need to be aware of that if I know that my user base involves this. So I would say best approach is get the entire, let's say, chain of things in the software lifecycle to have this thinking very consciously being done. And of course, being very careful before we release in terms of having the assurance itself done, that we have enough representation of identities and use cases, because that's a step that's totally flawed in the intent of trying to be agile and trying to release as soon as possible and then be okay with things to break. I think we're just totally being, again, not cognizant of the user base at all and being disrespectful of our users. That's how I would think of it.
And I would just add to that. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say quickly, I just want to make sure we have time for one last question. Too, that part of it is around, there's different ways that bias can manifest in an AI system. We actually delve into it a little bit in our playbook as well. And there's some forms of bias in terms of within the data set. If the data set is kind of over or underrepresented, there's some technical forms of bias that you can test, but there are these other forms of bias that are more reflective of kind of societal issues that are much harder to understand and to really take full account of. And it kind of goes to Alex's question around, is it possible to create a truly unbiased product? And I think the premise of how do we debias or unbias something is flawed in that it's not recognizing that bias exists in our world, and there's these different ways that it can come up and be reflected within AI systems, and it's not necessarily a technical issue. It's also just a reflection of the fact that data is historical, and it is a part of it. It reflects our existing world, and it also reflects the decisions of who decided to collect the data and how they collected it. Data is not necessarily objective. So it's kind of important to keep those pieces in mind. And we only have, I want to end with one last question, and this is going to be a rapid fire question for the group, but we are at a business school and thinking about, what is the responsibility of business schools in teaching about these topics of ethics and responsibility and advancing inclusive AI? And what might need to adapt, or what are suggestions? And I'm wondering if, Maria, you can take a quick stab, and then maybe Asif, and we'll end with any final comments from Jill.
That's an excellent question. Probably something that I would like to have studied in my MBA class, where I actually focus on corporate governance, strategy, and ethics, but I don't think it was enough. So I think it's phenomenally important for the business schools to get a better understanding of what AI means for business in general. And if that's the case, is how do we then bring all the other topics around AI, from what is it, the business case for AI in general, the ethical side, the risk, the governance, the human problem needs to happen. And with that story, divide the way of approaching it from a leadership perspective. I know that Said Business School in Oxford is trying to do something similar, working with the Oxford Internet Institute to create a curriculum that is driven by ethics and responsible build of technology and use within enterprises. So watch out for the examples to see what ways of teaching the subjects part of the MBA curriculum needs to happen. I think it's absolutely critical to get or to retain the competitive advantage an MBA brings, which is the big picture. And within the big picture, how AI changes or disrupts that big picture, and how a business leader like all of you in the making could play a role in advancing a responsible use of AI to change that big picture. And lastly, what's the role each organization with its component plays within the wider society? And what's the revised accountability for each of those organizations in building healthy societies and countries? Because we've seen the damage that big platforms are doing it to democracies. I think we also have to change the accountability level for corporation going forward.
Asif, some thoughts from you in a business school?
I would refer to the defining leadership principles at Haas, which is being student always. So for me, why I say that is, like, prior to my MBA, I did a machine learning bot as part of my work. And my understanding of diversity and biases in machine learning were a lot more narrow and probably limited in terms of scope than I understood. And I think the first semester of my MBA, we had a lot of discussions around types of biases and also ethics. And also I did machine learning courses in MBA. And I think that's when, like, my interpretation changed so much. And I think my worldview on this issue became a lot more deeper. And let's say it opened up a lot more things that I realized that I didn't know. I think this is an opportunity for us at Socratic to actually ensure that I practice what I've learned in this classroom. In fact, I'm in close touch with both the professors that I've learned machine learning with in terms of trying to deal with the bias problem. So I would definitely say that my MBA program has made me at least throw a lot of questions at me and make me think of these questions. And that's the reason I've made it a conscious choice that we start early than later. And I think I'm actually working on it. So I have more questions than answers. But I think that's been a progress for me from where I was. So I'm hopefully going to find some answers, if not all. So yeah, let's see.
Yeah. And Joe, I know we're a little over, but if you would like to say any final quick conclusion from your side.
Yes. So I want to say first, MBA schools have an obligation, an opportunity, and the need to teach ethics, and not just compliance and not just legal, but they need to teach ethics and how to think about these difficult problems, because they're never going to be the same problem twice. So you need ways to think about how are people helped? How are they harmed? What are the unintended consequences? And most importantly, what are the societal impacts of what you're doing? And to answer the other question, which is related to this, there is no way to create an unbiased product. So declare your bias, put it on the side of the box like an ingredient, and know what your biases are so that you can then mitigate for them and innovate for everyone.
Great, thanks so much. So we have our next brown bag session. We'll be looking at the AI model, so specifically around strategies to promote inclusive AI and mitigate bias when it comes to data sets and algorithms. So hopefully folks can join for that. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. This was wonderful, and thanks for the conversation, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.